Hello, everyone. Welcome to Not Your Average Goat. This is a show that celebrates all the shapes, sizes, and colors of diversity as well as adversity, while creating a space for authentic and vulnerable conversations that hopefully you find to be meaningful and relatable. Through these conversations, my guests and I hope to have an impact on dismantling deeply ingrained stigma and prejudice.
We met back in 2015, which seems so incredible to think about it. So almost 7 years ago. Mm-hmm. And we were both living in Crystal City, Virginia, which I don't think it's called Crystal City anymore, right? Because since Amazon kind of went in and took over the neighborhood, it's called National Landing, I believe now.
Correct. It's called National Landing now, and they continually work on rebranding it for National Landing.
Yeah. So, but I remember one night recently after moving into this apartment that we both lived in, there was a social media group, if you will, for our building. And I remember seeing a message from this woman named Lisa saying, hey, I'm looking to meet new people in the neighborhood. I just moved here from Chicago, and you recommended starting a book club or a potluck or something around that sort. And then a few weeks later, or maybe a couple days later, we all met up at McCormick and Schmidt. It was a handful of us. And I remember you were like, you'll know me because I will have a pot, a literal pot with me. And I just remember meeting you, and there was another woman there too. And it was just a really great conversation. And, things just kind of took off, and you started planning different events for our group. For the most part, everyone stayed in touch for pretty long. I don't know that everyone's still in touch today, but I think you definitely helped bridge and connect a lot of people, which was really, really great.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there are a few of us that do stay in contact with one another. I mean, we're in contact with each other, even though I know we don't see each other very often. And I don't know if you remember Paul. He had the dog, Maxie.
Yeah.
So Paul's become a good friend. In fact, he just stayed at our place this past week when we were on vacation and kind of kept an eye on our flowers. And, a few other people I keep in contact with as well.
Well, Lisa, when I did first meet you, you were actually still in the tourism space working. But today you are actually the chief operating officer for a local public accounting firm. And in addition to that, you've also held a couple of roles in the public service space. You were a police dispatcher. You were also an administrator for a school, which basically the principal of the school. So you've had so many different careers throughout your life. And that's one thing about your journey that I think is just so remarkable, and that you could potentially give inspiration to people who really don't think that different career changes and journeys are possible.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you. It's definitely been an interesting journey these past years.
If you can remember, what did you want to be when you were younger, 8, 9 years old? Do you remember kind of what little girl Lisa wanted to be back then?
Oh, absolutely. I think, like many girls my age at that point in time, we really wanted to be teachers. That was a focus of mine. It isn't ended up I did end up becoming a teacher, later in life, but it wasn't what happened right after I got out of high school, because I got married so young, as, you and I have talked about. But I remember wanting to be a teacher and, playing school and being very excited when my cousin, who was much older than me, was a teacher at her school. And every so often she would bring me, as, a young girl of 8, 9, 10 years old, a couple of workbooks and a teacher's guide. And I was absolutely in heaven, playing school with my dolls and, eventually with my friends. So that's what I wanted to do when I was younger. And, it ended up happening later in life, but not immediately.
Yeah, because the first career you had the major career is as the police dispatcher, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
So basically what happened is, I had gotten married very young. I got married at 19 years old to my high school sweetheart. And actually, I grew up in a Lithuanian, traditional Eastern European family. So really, even though I was bright and I had opportunities, presented to me in high school because I was the president of a couple of different clubs and things like that. College was really never an option as I was growing up because my parents' goal for me was to get married and have babies. That was just sort of, the goal. And right, wrong, or indifferent, it was just the way they lived their life and what they thought should happen to women or for women. So I got married at 19 years old, had my first child by the time I was 20 and a half, and got divorced about 15 months, maybe 2 years at the most, after I had gotten married to my high school sweetheart, because I wasn't happy and neither was he, and we were just way too young. But at that point, I honestly needed a job and I had no idea what I could do. So in the local newspaper, the local police department where I was living at the time had a job for a police dispatcher. And I really didn't even know what that was, but I knew that it paid $4.25 an hour, which seems like such a ridiculous amount of money right now. And so I applied for it and ended up getting that job and really enjoyed it and met my second husband there and really enjoyed that job for about 8 years.
I would like to kind of go back to your childhood for a little bit. So where did you grow up?
Up until I was about 10 years old, we lived in Chicago. In a Lithuanian neighborhood. And we actually spoke Lithuanian for a while at home until my grandmother passed away. And then we just didn't speak Lithuanian anymore. And then we moved to a town called Wakanda, Illinois. My father's parents had a cottage there. And so my parents bought a piece of property on a channel leading out to the lake. And we built a home at that time. It was kind of a cool thing. My father built a home for us and we moved to Wakanda Island Lake neighborhood outside of Chicago.
So was your mother Lithuanian or was your father Lithuanian?
Both my parents were Lithuanian, actually. Oh. My father had, his parents, for some reason, didn't think being Lithuanian was wasn't fancy enough, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
So they would always say they were Croatian, which I think is very funny, because his parents were from what was then Yugoslavia, which doesn't exist anymore. Mm-hmm. But, in my DNA tests, I test out to be like 99% Lithuanian. So I would say that my father was Lithuanian, although his parents thought it was cooler to say they were Croatian.
Were there any specific cultural values that you can think of? I know you said that you felt kind of like you were groomed as soon as you were an adult, that you had to get married and start having kids. Is there anything else kind of from that cultural perspective that you think you and your brother were taught that not the average American children are taught?
Family is really important to both my brother and I.
Yeah.
While my brother wasn't particularly close to my mother, he was really close to my father. I was close to both my parents in different ways. We were taught that family was really important and that sort of, you kind of relied on one another and you helped one another out. So I do believe I think most American children or most children across the world, are raised probably in a similar way. But that was definitely a part of our life. And really most of our events when I was growing up centered around family gatherings. My mom was an only child and somewhat aristocratic in a way. And so, family events on my mother's side of the family were much more lavish than my father's side of the family, who, had 18 brothers and sisters.
Oh my goodness.
Getting together with my dad's side of the family, when my dad's, siblings got older, of course, and had kids, was an absolute blast because it was just always so much fun. So family was really central to us, and it still is to me today. It's hard living in DC and being away from my own children and grandchildren. And eventually, when I retire, I'll move back to be closer to where my kids live. But also, honestly, like my mother really never worked. My father was a breadwinner. My mother would occasionally work. I'm assuming when they were maybe short on money or something like that, she would get a part-time job. It usually didn't last very long because she had a lot of problems with alcohol. So that usually, stopped jobs fairly short. But the idea of a woman and her place in the world, and this would be, even in the 70s, which I was when I was in high school, was really still at that point in the circle that we lived in, just to really, get married and have kids, and you just rely on the husband, and you don't really pursue your own dreams. And internally, that really wasn't who I was, but it was what I became for a while.
I know as a child, there was a a lot of, I guess, challenges and issues that went on, especially as it relates to your mother and her dealing with alcoholism. I guess, how old were you when you kind of realized that she was struggling with that, and kind of how did that shape your experience growing up?
Well, I think that, I have very early memories of some things my mother did, which I recognized later in life were probably due to alcohol. I remember for example, one time my brother and we were still living in Chicago in our first home. And my brother and I were quite small. We probably were about maybe my brother was 5 and I might've been 7 at the most. We're 18 months apart. And my mother just had us pack all our clothes up and tell us that she was mad at us and we were going to go to an orphanage, which is a pretty traumatic experience for somebody who's quite young, and I remember being very scared. And, we got in the car with my mom and she probably was drinking and, took us to a grocery store parking lot and just said this lady was going to come and, take us to an orphanage because we weren't behaving. And when you're that young, you don't even really realize what you were doing that was wrong. Who knows? I have zero idea what that could have been about, so that, now that I look back later in life, I kind of realized that. I also have recognized that I think my mother's alcoholism was really a manifestation of her not being able to fulfill herself, because I've always struggled with and continue to this day. Like I'm a people pleaser and I always want to help other people. But then sometimes I become frustrated that I've gone ahead and just extended myself yet again, because my time is usually pretty limited and I don't have a lot of time to myself. So I think that my mom, when I look back at it now, I think she kind of used alcohol as a way to escape. And for me as an adult, that's always been something I've been very aware of and very concerned about, is not becoming a person that would become dependent on any kind of, substance to help me get through life.
It's very interesting, I think, to look back on some of those experiences years later, because like you alluded to, in the moment, especially when you're young, it's really hard to understand even what's happening to you,
right,
or like why it's happening. And I think, I think all of us at some point or another, maybe some of us more than others, have had struggles with parents, conflicts. And I look back on, I don't have the best relationship with my mother, even today. Growing up, it was very, very, very tough. Me and my sisters are pretty sure that my mother is undiagnosed with a mental health condition, and just she really just never acknowledged it. And being like a very radical Christian, was like, just didn't really believe that even mental health was a thing.
Right.
So like that was very tough, because it kind of like, she would go through many of these periods where, she was angry and, put a lot of the responsibility on us as children that should never have been put on us. And so I still struggle a lot and I still get angry a lot. But I think looking back on it, like 20 plus years later, I definitely have a different perspective, or a slightly different perspective, and almost feeling sorry for my mom. And so I think some of that anger has dwindled. But it's still hard to look back, because it's not like you can go back and change time and like that part of that childhood back.
Right. And I think that you're similar to me in one area, in that we want to fix things, so my goal was always to try to fix my mother, whatever that meant. And I don't even know what that meant when I was younger, but it certainly, as I got older, trying to rationalize with her. And then finally, one day I just realized I can't compete against a bottle of vodka. And by the time she decided to stop, drinking alcohol, she got addicted to oxycontin. And that just, there's a whole lot involved with that, but that just went on for years as well. And so, it's always just one substitute for another. But I actually think it was just a substitute. Now that I'm older, I realize it was a substitute for her own unhappiness and her own inability to be able to rise above and sort of figure out how to take control of her life. I think she was raised at a time when, women taking care of themselves and trying to rise up and speak out was probably subdued or oppressed, where my parents didn't oppress me, but they also didn't. Well, my father did. My mother really didn't encourage me. And I sometimes think to myself too, that my mother not encouraged me like to not get married, because I didn't really want to get married, but I did, it was a way to get out of the house for sure, because I didn't think at the time, well, I could afford to live on my own. Although, quite frankly, I am the one who bought our first house. So I don't know why at that time I didn't think I could make it on my own, because I have. But when you're 19 years old, you don't have any frame of reference for things like that. It's just, I think she lived a life that she just felt unfulfilled. And I think in some ways, maybe my always trying to do something with my life and I've been involved in a million different things and, given my all to a lot of different organizations. I think maybe in some way she was kind of jealous of that, like not jealous of me, but just jealous of the opportunity that I felt comfortable seeking, which also caused sort of friction in our life. Because I don't think that she felt I spent enough time with her, although believe me, I honestly did.
Yeah, that sounds really tough. I can definitely empathize with that a lot. You get married, like you mentioned, at 19. You have your first daughter at 20. Like barring some of the challenges around that experience, like what was that like to have to like get pregnant and have a daughter?
Well, having a daughter was wonderful. I mean, that's a great experience. When I found out that I was pregnant with my daughter, I mean, we got married in May of 1978, and I became pregnant in October of 1978 and had our daughter, in August of 1979. And so when I initially became pregnant, I really wasn't happy about it. And not that I love my daughter, so I would never want her to, in any way, shape, or form, ever think that I don't. But at that time, I was scared. I was young. I really wasn't happy in my marriage. I really, we were just two people kind of just thrown together. It really wasn't meant to be. And then, of course, we became pregnant and, we ended up, having our daughter, of course, and that was beautiful. But by March of 1980, we were already divorced. So that was, kind of an interesting time in my life. But, having my daughter and being a mother has always been something that I felt very good about and very proud of. And I'm proud of the woman she's become. And I'm proud of all my daughters, actually. And also, even looking back as a parent, when you're that young, you don't even really know what you're doing. So thank God she turned out okay.
Yeah.
Because God only knows, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sure many parents feel like that. Chris and I don't have kids yet, but I think about it and I'm like, I don't know if I like it. I feel so conflicted being responsible for another human being's life.
Right.
It seems so scary.
It is scary. And you don't, you make mistakes and you don't know what you're doing. And, when you're that young, you're just still trying to figure yourself out, let alone now you've got another human being that you've got to raise. And, it's just kind of a blur, actually, but it all worked out. And she's turned out to be a wonderful woman and one of my best friends.
So unfortunately, that marriage, your first marriage, ends, but you actually end up meeting another guy shortly after. Can you tell me a little bit about him?
So at this point, when I had gotten divorced, shortly before I got divorced, I got the job at the police department. And that's where I met my second husband. And we really didn't date for very long. So he had he was 11 years older than me. He had recently gotten divorced. He had two children, of whom I have a very strong and adoptive relationship with, the daughter, who was 5 at the time, actually 4.5 at the time. And his son was 8.5 at the time. And he had custody of his children. So we met and I started actually kind of babysitting for his kids as like for a little extra money. And then occasionally he would watch my daughter for me, although my parents, at this point in life, my mom was not drinking. She was dry for about 10 years and she would help me, with my daughter, Amber, which was great. So we started, watching each other's kids, and then just one thing led to another. And the next thing I know, by August of the same year I got divorced in 1980, we're married. So, and not for any reason, not for, pregnancy or anything like that. We just got married. And, that marriage lasted 14 years, but it also had an element of alcohol toward the end, which caused a lot of spousal abuse on his part to me. And I ended up having to leave that marriage, fortunately, with my life, but it was a pretty scary day the day I did get out of there.
What do you kind of remember about your like mental headspace back then? And like I've heard or seen a lot of stories about women dealing with physical abuse, especially when they're younger, and it can be a very scary, very traumatic experience. And not everyone knows how to get out. And some people feel very scared to even try to get out because of the ramifications of trying to escaping seeming much worse than just staying. So what do you really think contributed to your strength in being able to get out? And what advice do you have for anyone who might be dealing with something like that?
Well, it was a long process, to be honest with you, Tisha, because there were a lot of complicating factors. One is that, as we got deeper into the marriage and I wanted to continue to grow as a person, one of the things I wanted to do was to go to college. I was still working at the police department at the time, and then decided to take a job as a teaching assistant because I wanted a schedule that was a little bit more in tune with our family. And, there was a lot of arguments about, whether I should leave the police department and, everything. And I realized, now it was more control. Like, if I worked in the same police department where he worked, which is we both worked in the same department, then really you kind of knew every single part of my life all the time. I was either at home or I was at work, or my parents, really nowhere else ever. So, when I decided that I wanted to take this job as a teaching assistant, there was a lot of just conflict in our relationship regarding that. I ended up doing it because I said, I think it's going to be better for our family. And then when I was working as a teaching assistant, an opportunity came up with the state of Illinois at the time, because they were in need of special education teachers, to basically go to college on their dollar. They would pay for it. And you then had to commit to working, as a special ed teacher for a couple of years. And so that's what I did. But that's when things really started to go south in our marriage, because he did not like the fact that I was going to school, meeting a whole new set of people. And I'll tell you the truth, the majority of them were way younger than me, because I was already, married with kids. And most of the people that were going to school were, college kids, right out of high school. So it wasn't like there was a peer set there for me, but it was really an opportunity for me to grow and meet new people. And eventually, that just led to a lot of problems, because he, for some reason, I have no idea why, because I never gave him a reason to not trust me. Pretty hard to do anything when you have, at this time now we have another daughter, so 4 kids, and a responsibility to the family, and you're working and you're going to school full time. But that, that's when it really kind of, the physical abuse started, because he became really controlling. He would do crazy things like, in order for me to go to school, I needed to drive there because I was going to school at night. He would take like the catalytic converter off the car, so that like my car wouldn't start. So I'd call somebody to come and start the car, and they would tell me that like a part was missing. So it sort of started with stuff like that. And then it just eventually got worse. If I'd be home from school a little bit later, because maybe I'd be standing in the parking lot talking to someone about, whatever after school, and I'd be home later than he thought it would be. Well, then, then you're locked out of your house and you can't get in your house, or you're, assaulted in the yard of your home, because, you're accused of doing something that, didn't exist. And all these situations that occurred were always because he'd come home from work, he'd have a couple of drinks, and alcohol just affected him in a way that it shouldn't. It made him mean. He doesn't drink anymore. He hasn't in a long time, actually. But it, eventually I just needed to get out. And so the final day that I did get out of the house, it was a really bad situation. Fortunately, only one of our daughters was home. It was our youngest. She was up in her bedroom. And he was coming after me with a fireplace poker in the living room of our home. And I really thought he was going to kill me. I really didn't know. I'm going to cry now. And then my daughter, I remember her running down the staircase of the home that we lived in. And I was yelling at her, go, call 911, call 911. Well, he ran up after her to tell her not to call 911, which was my, chance to get out of the house and escape. So I did. I got out of the house. I ran to a neighbor's house. They weren't home. Ran to another neighbor's house who allowed me to come in and, harbored me for a while until I could get a hold of someone. I got a hold of my parents and my brother, but it was really embarrassing because they didn't really know that much about what was going on. Like I wasn't really sharing with them because it's embarrassing. And I'll tell you, getting out of the marriage, I was scared because he also controlled our money. And I had no idea how I was going to support myself or live, because at that time, paychecks came in the mail. So, if I didn't get home before the mailman got there, and he was there when the mailman was there, he would take my paycheck, and put it in our bank account, which I had no access to. So it sounds ridiculous, but that was how it was. And that's how I just decided I couldn't do it anymore and got out and ended up going to court, getting an order of protection against him. He was a police officer, so it was kind of difficult to get people to sort of support me. He was a pretty well-known police officer, a detective actually in the area that we lived, in the county that we lived. So it took a bit of magic with my attorney to kind of get that to happen, but it did. And then eventually, it took a couple of years, but we did get divorced. We never lived together again after that day, but it took a while to get divorced.
Wow, that sounds so scary, Lisa. I can't
Well, it wasn't
imagine.
fun. I'll tell you that much.
Yeah. So did you end up moving in with your parents for a little bit?
Only for a really short period of time, like just a couple of days, actually. And then I ended up finding a place that was a gated community, and took money out of my teacher retirement system at the time. I just took a loan from that to be able to. Well, my parents gave me a little bit of money at first, like $1,000, just to secure the place, and then I ended up just taking money really out of my retirement system, to live on for a while till I could get on my feet.
Well, I give you so much kudos for being able for getting out and doing the best thing for you, and also probably for the kids.
For the kids, yes.
Yeah, I mean, because even if they weren't experiencing the abuse themselves, just witnessing it,
it's abusive. I mean,
it is, yeah.
It's traumatic for them, right?
Yeah. So I'm so glad you're able to get out of that situation. But I'm also so glad that it sounds like he's taken a complete turn in his life.
After all that happened, and it probably took him maybe about 4 or 5 years afterwards to really kind of just, realize that he was going down a path that where he wasn't going to have anybody in his family that loved him anymore, or that wanted to be around him. And so, he did a lot to change his life, and he really did. I mean, this is quite a few years ago, and he has become a much different person, a much better person. And I forgave him, but I mean, forgiving someone else really is a gift to yourself, because if you harbor animosity towards someone and you don't forgive them, then you're really not living your own life in peace. You're just hurting yourself.
You got married when you were very young. That marriage did not work out mainly because you guys were just both very, very young. Your second marriage, you dealt with a lot in terms of abuse with your husband. And then you get married a third time in 95. And that marriage, unfortunately, had a lot of tragedy wrapped up in it. Can you take me back a little bit, though? How did you actually end up meeting your third husband?
Right. So when I moved into this condominium complex, before I had actually gotten divorced from my second husband,
Yeah.
I moved into this condominium complex because it was a gated community. It sounds way more luxurious than it really was, but they had security, so you couldn't get in without, giving them a pass, or, they'd open the gate for you. So I moved there, and he was actually the maintenance manager at that location. He had retired he was also 11 years older than me. He had retired from Illinois Bell at the time, and, still fairly young, but he had retired because they were bought by AT&T, and he didn't move on with them. He became the maintenance manager there, and that's how I met him. Some mutual friends of ours, people I knew and people he knew. I didn't know that he had an interest in me, but my friends invited me over for dinner, and he happened to be there. And apparently he had said to them, hey, could you invite, that girl? I think you know her. And so we dated for probably a year and a half to almost 2 years before we decided to get married. I honestly did not want to get married again, because I'm like, all right, I've already been married twice. I don't really think my kids need to go through this again. But we talked and talked and talked and talked about it. And then, we ended up getting married. But we weren't married for more than a couple of years before he was diagnosed with cancer. And unfortunately, it did take his life. And so the last, 3 years of our marriage were pretty hard, because there was a lot going on. My father also had cancer at the time. So my mother was, an alcoholic and going pretty cuckoo. I had kids who were teenagers at this time. So there's all that stuff that goes on with teenagers. My husband's dying, my father's dying, and I'm just like, oh my goodness, how am I ever going to survive this? But I did. We actually got divorced, he and I, before he passed away, and they're the only reason for that. And I didn't want to do it, but he really encouraged me to do it. And to this day, I think it was a blessing in disguise, because at that time you could not get on someone's medical plan if you had a pre-existing condition. So when he had gotten diagnosed with cancer shortly after that, he wasn't able to work. And so he lost his medical insurance, and he wasn't qualified for Medicaid because he was getting a pension from Illinois Bell. And he ended up, going through all that money pay for his medical expenses. So to leave me with less debt, because I was left with a lot of debt, leave me with less medical debt. We opted to get divorced, so that anything that happened after that, would be on him only and not me. Now, we didn't know at the time that would be such a short-lived experience, because it was really only a few months before he passed away. But we did do that. And, I kind of think it was a blessing in disguise. And I used to be embarrassed about it, but I'm not anymore, because I was left with, 6 figures of medical debt that I worked through after he passed.
Wow. Well, I mean, firstly, I just want to say, I think that that's so remarkable that given, trying to put myself in his shoes and think about my headspace, knowing that I'm dealing with cancer and dying and I'm married, just for him, like you said, like a blessing in disguise for him to think about that and the impact that him dying and you guys still being married having on you financially, like that just seems so remarkable that he was able to kind of just think very logistically in a way, going through something so serious. You've actually mentioned this a couple of times, but I think it's something that a lot of people deal with. And it's, you've mentioned feeling embarrassed, with this, in this instance, dealing with like the debt, but then also before with your second marriage, when you had to run to your neighbor to call your parents, and you said you felt embarrassed because they didn't really know much about your situation. And I think a lot of people who have gone through divorces, they feel this. And I kind of like to call it like dealing with shame in a way, like feeling ashamed that this is your experience and what you're going through, even though it's not something that you can control. And I just want to say that, I can't speak for everyone, but I hope that no one is ever like passing judgment or making someone feel ashamed for the experiences that they go through, especially when they're so devastating and traumatic, like the ones you're talking about, because I think it's very sad if that is what's happening. And it seems like today you've been able to work through that, but I'm like, it pains me to know that you were kind of dealing with that type of headspace back then.
Well, I guess, when I look back at it now, yeah, it wasn't easy at all. Believe me, I spent many nights thinking about it and crying about it and trying to figure out how everything was going to work out. But it did, and it's, for that situation, it's been 22 years now. So it's been a long time. And I recovered in more ways than one, of course, not only, emotionally, but also financially. So I think that I really try not to pass judgment on people, because I honestly don't know what their story is behind the story.
Yeah.
I really don't, because I know my own story. And, when you tell, like I'm telling you this story now, and you and I've had lots of conversations, so you know a lot about my life already, but it isn't something that I share with everyone. Because, it is hard for people to understand, like, oh gosh, you've been married 3 times, you were in debt. People don't know that, but, because most people see me and they just see who they see today, which is good, and my kids, I don't dwell on anything like that with them. I rarely talk about it. I mean, they know the story. They don't need to hear the story again, and so I don't think they think about those things. I think all they think about is, hey, somehow, mom, we're here today and we're doing well, and they're good moms, and, we have a great relationship. So I think somewhere along the line, something just went the way it was supposed to.
Since 1949, the American Business Women's Association has been bringing together businesswomen of diverse occupations to provide them with opportunities to help themselves and others grow personally and professionally through leadership, education, networking, and national recognition. Learn more at abwa.org.
The big thing that happened is you really taking that teaching assistant job, right, and leaving the police department. What kind of triggered? So like, what was it like being a police dispatcher? Were there any specific experiences during that time that stand out to you? And like, what ultimately led to you wanting to leave that career?
Sure. Well, I wanted to leave the career mainly because I wanted to do something different for our family. I wanted to have better working hours because at the time, my husband and I were both working. Sometimes we'd work the same shift or sometimes we'd work alternate shifts. And it wasn't a healthy environment for the kids. And you're working weekends and holidays and all that. And so that was really the impetus for it. And I also did at that point really start thinking that I wanted a college degree. That just seemed to be really important to me. So that's why I left. But yeah, when I worked as a police dispatcher, there were a lot of things that I think helped shape me as a person today. One is I got an opportunity to help create CENTCOM, which is a centralized dispatch system. There were five different, police departments that were small towns, but they all had their own individual dispatch centers, as well as the fire department. And so I was on a committee and then eventually led that committee to take all five of those departments and the police department or the fire department and pull it all together into one centralized dispatch center, which saved costs across the board. But also then, really allowed us to pull our resources so that we could have better technology. And, at that time, things were changing quite a bit with the way you communicated with police officers and the services that were available that individually as departments we couldn't afford, but collectively we could. And CENTCOM still exists to this day. It's grown quite a bit, since I left there. I kind of wonder at some point, if I would have stayed, I probably would have been the director of it, I think. And, what would that have looked like over time? But, I did end up leaving when we finally got that up and running about a year later and went off to, pursue something else.
That's so cool. And it also sounds like you've had operations in your blood for a very long time.
It certainly feels that way. Yeah.
So what was that like, becoming a teaching assistant? What do you remember most about that experience and then becoming a teacher?
Being a teaching assistant was really interesting because I worked in a classroom. And when I taught children with behavior problems for second and third grade. And so a teaching assistant in a classroom like that with kids who are really, they're really messed up, which is really sad. I mean, just the behaviors and the kinds of trauma that these kids saw that, manifested itself in different ways in a school environment is really startling when you think that these kids are like 6, 7, and 8 years old, So I enjoyed it quite a bit. I liked the teacher that I worked with quite a bit. I did eventually like having my own classroom and having a teaching assistant. At one time I had two actually, that worked with me. So that was really enjoyable. And it was great to see the growth in the kids. A little hard though to send them home on the weekends because you knew when they came back to school on Monday that it may not be the same child that you sent home on Friday. So because there'd be regression over the weekend or regression over the summer, because usually these kids we would mainstream them out, meaning that we would put them in with the general population of students, but a lot of their instruction was very centralized to our classroom. And so you had a lot of behavior modification programs that you worked on and things like that, just to help the kids sort of be able to structure their lives and control their lives, in this environment of 7 hours a day.
Wow. Are there any students that you remember that really stood out to you and stuck with you throughout the years?
There's a couple. I've lost contact with all of them now. And there's a couple students who, one I really wanted to adopt because he was in a foster family, and the foster family was great, but they weren't in a position to adopt him. And I really wanted to adopt him, but I never did. And so I remember him, and I remember another young boy that I got pretty close to his family. And, I think I had an impact on his life, and he certainly had an impact on mine as well. And that was somebody who I remember. I don't know where these kids are today. I've never tried to look them up or, find them on Facebook or anything like that, because I just think it'd probably be pretty weird for, this lady to be reaching out to these kids who probably don't even remember me because, they were so young.
Throughout COVID, I think teachers have had it especially hard. And I think that there's been so much criticism of educators because, well, a lot of it comes from parents who basically want their babysitters back.
Right.
And I feel very conflicted about that. I mean, I don't have kids, but I still feel like it's valid for me to have an opinion on how we treat educators and view them. But I think something that gets overlooked, especially, are those who are dealing with special education. Is there anything that you think is important to address, like when it comes to any myths or misconceptions that you remember people having back then?
I do. And I think it even exists today. I also have a daughter who is a curriculum administrator for her school district.
Yeah.
So, and she's got, started her career as a special ed teacher and then a reading specialist and now a curriculum administrator. So she's, certainly lived through this whole COVID situation, with her in her school community and with the parents. But in terms of children with special needs, one thing that people don't realize is, this is a little person or an older child, that are kind of just fighting their own bodies, especially if they have physical handicaps or, mental handicaps. They honestly, they don't really they know, I think they understand that they're different, different from the regular population, but it is who they are and it's the life that they lead. And so I think people have a misconception about emotions or how these children feel, or that they are unfeeling, or that they act out because they're bad, and they're not. I mean, they just sometimes don't have coping skills. They don't know what to do. And so I'm very empathetic toward parents who have children with special needs, or empathetic to even children who are crying on a plane, because they're scared. They don't know how to react. That's the only coping skill they have. So I think it would be great if the world would just look at children, good and bad, children with and without disabilities, in a way, understanding that most of the time when kids are acting out, it's because they really don't know what else to do.
Yeah, that's a really good perspective.
And sometimes the parents don't know what to do either, which just, makes the situation even harder.
Yeah. And I imagine that in those cases, a lot of parents kind of just act out themselves, being frustrated, not knowing what to do, which is not the best way to handle it.
Right.
So you are a teacher for a little bit, and then you become a school administrator, which essentially you're kind of the principal of the school. How did that transition happen?
Well, kind of by chance. So I was working I was working in the classroom, and then I switched to basically the administrative assistant to the assistant superintendent role, which an administrative assistant in a school system is different than like an administrative assistant in an office. It's actually a titled position, because you're administrating certain things. So like for me, my administrative duties at that time were managing all of our non-certified staff. So meaning managing all our bus drivers, our librarians, our custodians, our teaching assistants, that whole population. So I was doing that, but then our assistant principal became the assistant superintendent, and they needed to have somebody in charge of the school, but I did not have what was called a type 75 license. So I didn't have a principal's license. So they basically retitled the position to be a school administrator. And so, I had the power to do everything, including suspend children from school, which normally you need if you have an administrative certificate. But that's how that all happened, is they saw that, I probably could handle the job. And I had a basic knowledge of, curriculum. This was a junior high school, also a basic knowledge of curriculum. I was already really involved with our student population because I was planning our trips to Washington, D.C. So I also was in charge of like all our extracurricular programming in our school. And so that's how that happened. But anything that needed to be where we needed to have a sign off on a grant or something like that, then I had to go to who eventually became our superintendent to have her sign off, because I did not have the type 75 credential to be able to do that. And just about the time when I was working on getting my type 75, I had gotten married again, and then my husband passed away, and I decided I needed to do something different, sort of get into a different environment. I got involved in tourism with the company that I was using to send my students to Washington, D.C. for their 8th grade trip. So I never finished my certification, but I held the role for almost 5.5 years.
That's so cool. That's so
Pretty
awesome.
funny, actually.
But it's so awesome, because like in a way, like I feel like as a teaching assistant, like that's kind of almost like an intern level, and then you go to kind of being the CEO in a way. Right. So that's really cool that you took that journey throughout the education system.
Yeah.
During those 5.5 years, is there anything in particular that stands out to you?
Yeah, I think the thing I'm most proud of is that I worked in a school district that was pretty small. And also it was a school district of a very, very large population of students who didn't have much, and then a small population of students who had everything, because the community was really diverse. It was either you were really wealthy or you weren't. No middle ground. So I started in 6th grade with our students fundraising so that every single student, by the time they got to 8th grade, could go on the 8th grade school trip. And so we had, at the time, our population of 8th graders was 105. So, fundraising with those kids from 6th grade, creating little bank accounts for them and having them, save money to be able to go on that 8th grade trip was pretty rewarding. The second thing I did is I've always been pretty committed to experiential learning, because I think kids learn by doing more than they learn by reading a book or taking a test. And so we had an abandoned grocery store in our neighborhood, and I got a hold of the owner of the building, and I asked if, as long as it was safe, if we could bring our 7th and 8th grade students in and just sort of had them reimagine what the space would look like, to sort of just like be architects and designers and entrepreneurs. And that was really fun. So we did that for about 6 months, and the kids came up with some really cool ideas for it. None of them ever panned out like this. The building owner never did anything with the ideas, but I think that was a really great experience for the kids.
That's really, really cool. I wish I had had an opportunity to do something like that in junior high. That's such a cool activity to do.
They loved it. They absolutely loved it.
Yeah. And it, like, for them, because they don't have much control or the ability to make much their own, to give them that opportunity to say, like, this is your space, do something like what you want to do with it. Like, that's really, really cool.
Yeah, that was fun. And ironically, one of the students that was part of that group is actually my son-in-law now. So he remembers that experience, and he's married to my youngest daughter. So it's pretty funny that, he still remembers, at the time, my last name, my last name was Curtin then. I was thinking it was Legenza, but it was Curtin. He remembers that. So.
You end up moving into the tourism space,
right?
Which sounds like it kind of stemmed from the job you were doing as a student administrator when you were helping to organize these trips to DC. So was it really just kind of building the connections to get that job in the tourism space, or how did that end up happening?
I happened to be talking, the owner of the company used to come to the airport to say goodbye to the school groups. He came almost all the time. And then eventually, I did it too. But we would go to O'Hare Airport and we would say goodbye to any of the groups that were traveling locally. The company had students travel from all over the country, but a good concentration of the groups came from the Chicagoland area. So he would come, and then just one day I got to talking to him about my life, because I'd been traveling with him at that point for 4 years with my students. And I was really looking for a career change. I was trying to kind of figure out what to do. I had to sort of reinvent my life, or I wanted to reinvent my life, and I wasn't sure what I wanted. He said, well, he said, well, you should come work for me. And I'm like, I know nothing about tourism. He said, no, but one thing I do know about you is that you're really organized. And then I know that you can lead, because I know what you've done with with the students here. So I went to work for him, and I never dreamed it would end up taking me to the places that it did take me to. I never dreamed that I would become the vice president of operations of that company had sold to a very large company. I never dreamed that, I would meet Bill Caldwell, who I work for now, and just have, a great friendship with him that's lasted for a long time now. And now, of course, I work for him. So it's just kind of interesting how that all happened.
So you go from being the school administrator now into this like tourism type of role. Mm-hmm. What was that? And you were there for about 16-ish years?
Correct.
Yeah. I mean, so like, can you talk to me about that experience and kind of like what you remember most about and also just, you were able to really climb the ladder in that type of industry. So can you talk to me about that a little bit?
Sure. So the tourism experience, which I'm still involved in tourism today, but in a different way, it was amazing. I loved it. I mean, for one thing, I got to travel. At first, early in my career in tourism, I was just an operations person, mainly planning trips to DC and booking restaurants and flights and things of that nature. But then eventually, I went on to manage a department, and then eventually I went on to manage the entire operational side of the business. And then eventually, when our business was sold to a very large public company, I had the opportunity to be the vice president of operations for 13 brands. So that was really exciting. It was a lot of work, a lot of hard work, a lot of time away from my family, because one thing people don't realize about tourism is, everyone sees, if you're a tourist, you see the end product, but you don't know all the components that go into putting that together, all the behind the scenes work, a lot of late nights, things that happen on tour that wake you up in the middle of the night. A bus breaks down, a child gets sick, someone dies on tour. I mean, these things all happen. And so in that role I gave up a lot of my personal life, because I was pretty focused on climbing the ladder at that job. And also, I really enjoyed it. And my kids were older at the time too, so that made it a little bit easier to do that job. I also got to travel to a lot of places I never would have been able to go to before in my life, because I wouldn't have had the money, but I got to travel on somebody else's dollar, which was nice. I mean, many places around the country for sure, but also in the world. We were spending like $90 million a year with different hotels and airlines and certain restaurants and things like that. So if people knew that I was coming to town, this sounds so arrogant, I would have like the red carpet rolled out, and I kind of got used to it, and it was really nice. And I really liked all those perks, but I never asked for anything. I never asked for any of those things. Like, I'd stay at a hotel and people would just have my name, in their register of how they keep track of what they consider to be people who spend money there. My name was attached to that. So I never asked for anything, but it was really nice that it always happened. So I loved that. And I also just learned a lot about people, managing teams in 13 brands with 13 different cultures was pretty interesting, trying to bring all that together, and not knowing what the heck I was doing sometimes. But, we made it, and we made it work, and that all worked out great. But then the company sold again, and again and again to private investors that really had absolutely no idea what tourism was all about. And eventually they moved me out of the position I had and made me a general manager, which was actually sort of a step down in a way. And they moved me out to DC, which is where I met you. But once I got out here, I could see the writing on the wall, because when you are in a corporation and you have a sort of a top heavy layer of VPs and executives, sooner or later, they're going to start cutting things. I survived like 3 cuts at that level, because I had a lot of client relationships, and they didn't really want, client being the people who booked the tours with us, they didn't really want to disrupt that. And I also had a pretty loyal team that I had been working with for, over 10 years. But when I got out here, I was just super unhappy. Unhappy that I was living here because I was away from my family, a little resentful. I could see that this company was being sold over and over again, and that sooner or later we were either going to, it was either going to implode, or there were just going to be more cuts. And so I decided that eventually I would resign, and I was going to go and run a company down in Houston, Texas. But I had a non-compete, and I had to sit out for a year. And Bill and I have been friends a long time, and his business was growing. And he said to me, maybe come on board with me for a year and sit out your non-compete and just sort of help us get things solidified operationally. And so I did that, still planning on running the company down in Houston, but a company down in Houston. But in the end, I'm still here, working here, and I love it. I love what we do. It's a very rewarding experience. The person I work for is amazing, and also given me a lot of opportunity to bring tourism into this business. And so we do a lot of, we're tax professionals, so we do a lot of tax for tourism, which was underrepresented in that industry. So we have a whole department devoted to that. I'm still going to the tourism conferences, so I'm getting all the fun without the headaches. So it's worked out really well.
You mentioned this, but you progressed to the VP of operations when you're working in the tourism space, yes, which is it's a pretty big job. It's a pretty big job. Your story, your journey, when you made it to that level, especially being a woman, a mother, a working mother, trying to juggle all of like your daughters and working. I mean, that's very, very tough. What do you remember about what your headspace was at that point when you finally got to that level?
I think my headspace was about how I was going to balance my family life. Yeah. And I was single. I balanced my family life with work, because work was pretty demanding, very demanding, actually. When you get to a level like that, it isn't you are working very hard. I don't mean to sound like, I don't want anyone to feel sorry for me, because certainly they shouldn't, but you do work a lot of hours and you are pretty much giving it your all. And being a woman, I was the only woman on our executive board. There were no other women but me. And so I was surrounded by a lot of men who had very large egos and who were also constantly vying for position, because they all knew that, sooner or later, their cushy jobs were going to go away. It just happens at that level. So I was, concerned also about like losing my job and just kind of always keeping my eye out for whatever the next opportunity could be. But mainly it was just sort of balancing my family life and making sure that I could do that. I can't say I did it very well all the time, but my kids were older, they were already in college. So that did make it a little bit easier.
I read one of your articles a couple of years ago, and you were talking about, what it really means to be like a small business owner in the travel and tourism space, or just like a small business owner in general, because I think a lot of what you talked about are points and philosophies that are very transferable despite the industry.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of more so around the leadership part of it. And I remember one thing that really stood out to me that you were talking about, working a lot, sometimes, quote unquote, 24/7, trying to juggle a lot of things, but then reflecting on, I'm doing this and, I'm really running myself thin, but like, what is that impression on the rest of the team? Like, how are the rest of the people on the team viewing me?
Yeah, I'm cognizant of that too. One year we had done a 360 review. The staff got to evaluate the managers. And I remember several times reading in reviews of myself that, that I accomplished a lot and I did a lot and I worked a lot, but that it was unrealistic and that no one else can ever reach that benchmark. And in some ways, possibly people didn't want to do it or they just couldn't do it. And that was a real eye opener to me, because I did realize that I was setting an example that probably was putting a lot of pressure on my team unknowingly. I mean, I just would just do it because that's just what I do. And I'm more cognizant of that in this job right here. Like I do give it my all. I mean, way more than I let people see, because I don't want people to feel like they can't, that they're not doing enough or that they're not doing good enough because I'm doing so much. I don't even know how to explain that the right way. I can't find the right words to articulate what I want to say right now, but I'll give you an example. Like, this week on Friday, we're closing at 1:00. So I will be leaving at 1:00. And the reason I want to leave at 1:00 is because I don't want everyone thinking that they have to stay longer than 1:00 because I'm still here, So things like that, that's just a good example of it. But you do realize that sometimes just the fact that you are doing so much without even realizing it, that you do set, it makes people anxious, I guess is the best word to use.
Yeah. And kind of like non-verbally sets these expectations.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
And there, and it's not that I mean, if you were to actually sit down with this person, you would say, hey, no, leave at 1 p.m. But if you're there until 3, if they're an employee below you, regardless of what you say, they're going to look at what you do. And
Right.
I've definitely been in situations where I've had like VPs like come in like super early at like 7 or like email me at 11 p.m. And I'm like, am I supposed to be up this late working?
I know. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But that takes a strong leader and a very good leader to recognize that and say, I've been doing this maybe not the best over the last couple of years, and to really be conscious of it and make a change, because not everyone is, courageous or vulnerable enough to do that. So I give you a lot of kudos for being able to make that pivot. Is there anything else that really kind of stands out to you? It's like whether it's the clients or the work itself that you really love about your COO role there?
Well, I definitely love being involved with our staff. I think we have a really great staff, and I'm really proud. And I say this all the time. I really love celebrating work anniversaries, because that means you're retaining your people. And if you retain your people, that means people are happy and they're going to take good care of the clients. But, there's work behind it, because employees, and I know you're an employee and I'm one too, but some employees quickly forget all the good you do. So you're constantly having to kind of reinvent, experiences that make people feel valued and appreciated. And believe me, we do we constantly know that and feel that, but you have to express it. And I can't understate that in any way, shape, or form, because it is one of the most important things, I think, for employees to feel appreciated and recognized. And so, like one of the things I like to do in the morning is literally personally say hello to everyone. And I do it randomly throughout the day, because sometimes we have two sides to our office, and sometimes I'm not on the other side. So I'm not going over there to say hi to see whether or not someone's sitting at their desk and they got in on time, because we're all professionals here. I'm truly going over to say hi, and I think that is important. So I really do enjoy our staff, and I really like our clients. We have a really diverse group of clients from all walks of life, all different kinds of businesses. And it's just so super interesting to talk to them. And in the kind of work that we do, it makes a difference in a client's life. I mean, like literally financially, it makes a difference in a client's life. And that's really rewarding as well, when you can either help them reach their financial goals or take away angst because they have some sort of tax issue. That's very rewarding as well.
That's so awesome. And I love what you said about, I think that's so nice that, I know a lot of businesses are still remote or hybrid nowadays, but I love that you go over and you say hello to everyone, because I think sometimes companies think of appreciating or recognizing your employees means doing something super grandiose, like throwing like an extravagant party or giving them a huge bonus, but some of these very small gestures, I think, just make some people's days. And like, I'm not intrinsically motivated by money myself. So something like that would like just feel so great to me, especially if it's done very sincerely and genuinely. So I really love that you do that.
Yeah, I just like saying hi to people. I just think it's really nice.
I know you're a social butterfly, at least.
Yeah. Well, it's funny too, because I'm actually more of an introvert. And so I really work hard at trying to be more extroverted. But, because inside basically I'm shy, and I'm always wondering if people like me. And even at my age now, I still think about that every day, which is completely ridiculous. I know, but I'm never going to get past it. I've kind of reconciled with the fact that this is who I am, and I'm always going to think this way. So it is, I think I just enjoy saying hi to people, and it's fun if you get a little tidbit about, what someone's day was like, or something their kid did, or something like that. I mean, it's just fun to share.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just enjoy it. It makes me feel good, and hopefully makes other people feel good too.
Yeah. And I think that's another thing we have in common too, is I am also very, very introverted.
I know, but you would never know it either, Tisha.
No. And because I think it's something too that I'm very conscious and aware of, and you have no idea. I think about that all the time. Like so it's so funny, maybe not funny. But when I was, a few of my closest friends in high school, we were not friends to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And then once we became really good friends, I would come to learn that when they first met me, they thought that I was very stuck up and looked down upon them, which I absolutely did not do. And so even today, like, I'm just very conscious and like always very insecure sometimes about, like if I say something, oh my gosh, like, did that come off friendly enough? Or was that too aggressive? And so I'm always having like second guessing, like, like, do people actually like me as well? And I think a lot of people struggle with that. And I really, really work to not care about that and just being myself. But it's something too that I'm not sure if it will ever go away, as you mentioned, but it's something I'm always trying to work on.
It probably won't. I think about people who I think don't think about that, like Jim. You haven't met Jim, correct?
No, I have not.
Okay. So we've been together 4 years now, and he's an amazing man. And he's not super social. He would be perfectly fine just being at home by himself, or being at home with me forever, and he'd be perfectly fine with that. That's just who he is. Where I need to have the energy of other people, mainly just because I get bored very easily, and I like to be around other people. It just kind of feeds my spirit. But he, you would think he's shy, but he's actually not. And it's kind of funny to me because he's so quiet, but he's not shy. Where I'm, on the other hand, I'm always like talking like crazy, and I am shy inside, and I am always thinking about what we just talked about, whether do people really like me,
Hi, my wonderful goat friends. Firstly, thank you so much for your support and listening. If you're enjoying this conversation and other episodes of the podcast, I'd like to ask you to please give us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple, or whichever platform you are listening on right now. And if you're so inclined, we'd love to hear your feedback in a full review. Also, might be a great idea to hit subscribe on that platform you're listening to right now so you can get notified of new episodes as they are released. Thank you so much again for being one of our loyal GOAT listeners.
In 2019, though, you don't actually do a career pivot because you don't leave Caldwell CPAs, but you start your own business, and it's in the travel industry, right?
It is. It's a business that actually I'm in a partnership with Bill. Together we own this company. And so it's called Safe Travel Consultants. And so what we do is we partner with travel associations and their members when certain travel associations have created a criteria to get a certification that you're like a safe travel operator or you're a family-friendly travel operator, whatever it happens to be. And they have all these standards that the associations themselves put together. And so when their members apply for these different certifications, they need to have a third party verify it, like audit it, to make sure that all the documents that they put forward are accurate. And then, and then I do with like a desk audit, basically look through all the paperwork that's come through and give some thoughts and observations on things that they might want to think about or areas where they've had, great success. And then I do a virtual visit with them. Used to be on site, but with COVID, it's virtual now. And we just kind of talk through, their current best practices. And then from that point forward, I write a report up and say that this particular candidate, needs a little more work in this area, or this candidate's meeting all the standards and they should get the certification. So that's what we're doing with that particular business. I don't know where it will go in the future. We've got some ideas on what we could do with that. It's also the arm for our more educational components. We do mainly Bill does a lot of speaking engagements on tax for tourism, tax for small business owners, tax for people with 1099 income. So we go to a lot of conferences and Bill will do a speaking engagement at those conferences in the tourism industry. We do them for other industries as well, but we've been focusing mainly on the tourism industry. And that's been really nice because the educational components are complementary, but we do gain business out of it.
Yeah, I think people really love that. And so I'm in the marketing space, as you know, and we try to do a lot of those like thought leadership type pieces to really kind of bring people in to the funnel, even if they're not ready to become a client or a customer at that point. But it definitely helps bring in a lot of people who will eventually kind of go down the funnel and become a paying customer. So thought leadership is amazing.
Yeah, it's worked out really well. And, like with the service that we provide, any service that anyone provides, right, you get a value from it because, generally what we're doing is saving people money. So that's always nice.
Yeah. Well, that's really, really cool. And I can definitely, in the show notes, I will link to that, as well as to I've seen some of Bill's keynotes, and they're really good. So I think people, if you do have a business in the tourism travel industry, they're very, very valuable to listen to, especially if you're trying to learn how to, save on taxes and find different tax breaks for your industry. So, Lisa, we are almost done, and you have no idea how appreciative I am that you made time for this. I know how unbelievably busy you are. But one thing I love to ask everyone, because everyone I'm bringing on the show has in one way or another inspired me. And I know that you have definitely had an impact on so many other people's lives as well. But I would love to know what or who in your life has been your biggest inspiration and why?
Well, there's a couple of them actually. So I'll keep my family out of it because there's a lot of family members in my life that have inspired me and encouraged me along the way. So I'm just going to talk about my professional life. So certainly the person that I worked for in the school district that was the assistant to the assistant superintendent, for which then I moved into her job when she became the superintendent. She definitely was someone who really inspired me and got to see me in a way I didn't see myself. And then the person I went to work for that owned the tour company that also saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. And I would say that the person I work for now, who's probably been a part of my life more than any of these other people have, has also seen something in me that I never saw in myself as well. And I also think that he actually helped me see the value of myself, not only professionally, but just even financially. He's helped me see my value and my worth that in a way I didn't see it before, for sure. And so that, and given me a lot of opportunity to grow professionally and even personally, to have a strong friendship with someone like that for a long time is pretty amazing. So I would say that those people definitely inspire me and have made me professionally, I think, who I am today.
That's so great. What do you think you've learned? You talked a little bit about most recently, but when you go back to the superintendent or the other person in the tourism space, what do you think they help teach you about yourself?
I think they helped me teach me. I think they taught me that you can kind of transfer skills. And that's something that I try to talk to young people about too, is that, don't put yourself in a box that you think that you can only do this one thing, because I've had 4 careers, but they've all had a theme of some way, shape, or form of organization and operational background. And believe me, there's a lot of things I still wish I could do with this company and, with other companies I worked for that I never really had the time or opportunity to do. And maybe sometimes I had the opportunity, but I just never had the time to get it done in the way I would want to. So it's just that, just don't limit yourself. And I think that each one of those people have taught me that too, that where I thought I had myself in a certain box and that I couldn't grow or reach beyond that, they helped me realize that I could do that.
And I think that that's something too. And I've witnessed firsthand with my husband, Chris, who you obviously know, but, he's also really had this like organizational, like find efficiencies, optimize processes type of thing about him. And he went down a very interesting road, starting with sales, retail, going into design, quality assurance, and finally figuring out that project management has been his calling all along. Mm-hmm. And it's something that I think that, because I think for a while he struggled with, and maybe other people struggle with, is like, well, I got this degree in this other thing and I paid so much money for it. Like my career needs to be about that. But at the end of the day, I will say this, and I actually work for a higher education company, but I will say this: it doesn't matter what your degree's in.
No, it doesn't.
It literally does not. And I saw this like really funny video a couple weeks ago, and it was like this person going in to apply for a job. And it's like, oh, like, you sound so great. Like, what is your degree in? And they're like, oh, I don't have a degree. I was like, oh, sorry. Like, we can't hire you. It's like, but I have all the skills that you're looking for. And then they bring in the second candidate who obviously has no skills related to the job, but they were like, oh, but I have a bachelor's degree in like music. And like the job is for like accounting or something like that. And they're like, oh, you're hired. It's like, but I know nothing about accounting. Well, but you have the degree. But it's just like a really funny way just to illustrate, like, it honestly does not matter what your degree is in. Just follow your passions. Yeah.
It doesn't even matter if you have a degree, to tell you the truth. If you have the skills, and the aptitude to learn, you don't really even need a degree. I mean, it's a degree, especially in this area, seems to open the door for you, but not in all cases. I think companies are starting to look a lot at, skills-based learning versus degrees. I could be wrong about that, but that's just,
I think you're spot on. I definitely agree with that.
Yeah. But yeah, that's it. So those are my people. And then personally, the person who's in my life right now is, his entire goal in life is to try to get me to chill out more and to have fun and not think about life so seriously. So he's working on that. It is definitely a work in progress, but he does try to create special things that get me to relax, or is thinking about ways to help me kind of refocus my thoughts so that I'm not always in this, work mode, serious mode, I got to accomplish this mode. So I really appreciate that, in him.
That's really nice. And I can definitely relate to that too, because I'm one of those people who feel like on a Saturday, if I'm awake at 5:30, 6 a.m., I will get up and I will start doing something, whether it's related to the podcast, like cleaning the house.
Right.
Like, I feel like I need to be doing something productive. And I feel like I feel so awkward, but I'm just sitting there not doing anything.
I know. I always tell Jim I want his life, because he has no problem staying in a robe all day long, watching movies, drinking tea, because he loves tea, and just, at some point taking a shower and maybe having a peanut butter sandwich. I'm like, oh my God, I want your life, because I would go absolutely crazy. I'd be jumping out of my skin. He's like, you should try it one day. It would be really good. I'm like, oh, I'll try it, but I don't know how long it's going to go for.
Yeah. I need something in the middle. I don't know if I could do that, but just something in the middle, maybe.
Right.
Yeah. Lisa, thank you so much for sitting down and talking to me. I know that so many people are going to get so much value out of hearing your story and your journey.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks for the opportunity, and hopefully we can get together sooner than later. Definitely before we leave this area, whenever that happens to be.
Yes, we will go get dinner or have a drink or something.
Exactly.
Not Your Average Goat is produced and edited by yours truly, with music by Sergey Quadrado and Anton Blazov. All content is copyrighted and should not be recreated, reproduced, or reused without explicit consent. Please visit notyouraveragegoat.org/contact for questions.